is the Vintage RPG Podcast, your source for the best in classic and contemporary RPGs. With your hosts, Hambone and Stu.
Welcome to the Vintage RPG Podcast, coming at you again from the clubhouse, hidden somewhere in the swamps of New Jersey. I'm John Hambone McGuire, and with me, as always, is the editor-in-chief of Unwinnable.com. This is an episode that probably should have been ready for Valentine's Day, but the apocalypse, Stu Horvath.
I posted them recently at the beginning of June, and they really should have been in Valentine's Day. What was I thinking?
I don't know, it's not that we don't care about love, but, this year we've had bigger fish to fry.
Yeah, everything's a distraction.
Everything really is. Stu, what are we talking about today?
We are talking about the series of Choose Your Own Adventure books from TSR called HeartQuest. As you can imagine, they're about heart stuff. Not like, heart health, like love.
Love and relationships between fantasy characters. It's so weird because this is an 80s thing, right? I mean, when you look at the cover works of these books, you'll see them in the feed on Vintage RPG's Instagram, and we will talk about the art a little later in the episode, but these are books that if you went into your local corner store or you went into any shopping store that had that spinner rack with the different novels on it, and I'm doing air quotes for those listening at home, novels, the sexy grandma books that my grandmother used to like to read with the Fabio looking dudes on the cover, all about like love. These were like the Sweet Valley High version of those books, and they were put out by TSR in the 80s.
It was an expansion of the Endless Quest Choose Your Own Adventures, which were basic, fantasy Dungeons and Dragons themed Choose Your Own Adventures for young readers. And these are sort of the equivalent for young girls, I guess. They're built around an element of romance. It's still a D&D story. They all have monsters that you recognize from the monster manuals. There's a dragon in one, which I was surprised by. I thought that these were just going to be like straight romance novels. But no, they're D&D romance novels. And they're really hard to come by. And I'd never seen these until about a year ago. And I got really excited about them because I thought, whoa, these are cool. This could be awesome. Because, you've not played the Dragon Age games, but that's like a thing in video games where it's like the romance option. People are highly invested in the romance subplots in a lot of video game RPGs, myself included. And I was thinking that these books would be sort of like that. I thought that, it would be like high adventure and a little bit of, mushy. And it's not. They're crap. They're terrible. They are such an appalling, it's just everything you don't want out of a book like this. It starts from this idea that girls couldn't possibly want the same thing out of a Dungeons & Dragons adventure that a boy would. From the first page, and it just immediately pissed me off, and I hated reading, or what, it's not really reading that I did. It was sort of like
a skimming.
Skimming, yeah, skimming is a good word. They're not very good. They're terrible. James Holloway does the art inside, and you can tell that he thought this was like a waste of his time because there's no effort on his part for the interior illustrations. It's just I'll crank these out in 15 minutes on my lunch break.
Yeah, when James Holloway is phoning it in. So the thing that really gets me about this is these came out in 1983, right? It's not like up until 1983 or before 1983, there hasn't been strong female leads in anything like, I don't know, Princess Leia, Ripley from Aliens. The fact that they were like, hey, we're just going to try to cash grab in on these choose your own adventure style books, but because they're for girls, we need to focus more on the feelings and the crying. And
there's so much crying. I can't understate how much crying there are in these books.
Yeah, and what does that say just as a hobby at that point? Because, we have seen old ads for Dungeons and Dragons where you have both men and women playing at a table together. So it's not like TSR hadn't already covered the ground that D&D is for everybody.
Yep.
It's just like now, maybe we should just, focus on the dime store romance aspect of the dungeon that nobody asked for.
I guess, in retrospect, this is true of so many things, right? But it's just frustrating to look back on it because it's just such a complete misreading of the potential audience. If I was a girl reading these books in 1983, I would have been so annoyed. The fourth one starts off with your father being kidnapped, but before he leaves, he's like, you got to stay home and tend to the business or whatever. So the first decision in the book that you have is, do you go after your father to rescue him, or do you stay home like dad said? It's so offensive to me. Like, could you imagine me starting a D&D campaign and giving y'all the option to stay home and behave?
You know, I would be more pissed if I actually showed up at your house and you were just like, all right, so here's your first choice. And if everyone was like, well, we're going to stay home and behave, it's like, well, why didn't we just do this over the phone then? I could be watching Magnum PI.
It's so patronizing. And then you're right. The protagonists are all fairly weepy. There is one where she's a fairly strong character and doesn't rely on the romantic interest to take care of everything. But the other three books that I've flipped through, she does. Most of the action is performed by these sort of heroic dudes who, eventually you kiss. And that's the story. And like, you kill the wizard, you save your dad.
But wait, do you kill the wizard, or do the big buff dudes kill the wizard for you, and then you get to the smooching?
I don't actually remember if the wizard dies. I feel like the solutions to these things are less couched in violence, which I think is interesting, but it's almost always the dude who takes care of it. These like super dudes.
Yeah, it's so weird. I mean, granted, like the 80s were what they were. We look back upon the decade and we know how people were represented on TV, and we know how people were represented in movies. Wasn't always good. However, like, even in like Disney movies, like the princess is the hero. Yes, there's going to be smooching. Yes, there's going to be singing. I love it. Awesome. However, in the end of the day, it's not so much like I could just stay home and sit this out while Fabio goes and tosses his long, luscious blonde locks into the wind and takes care of this dragon or wizard for me. Like who would buy these books? Like, I can't imagine they did very good publishing these books.
No, they didn't. They only ran through 83 and early 84. There's only 6 of them. They are very hard to come by. I don't think that they did very well. I don't think that they really marketed them very much. I mean, I always feel like I have like a pretty good broad knowledge of what TSR released. Like, I recognize stuff even if I don't know exactly what it is. But then I'm constantly surprised by things like HeartQuest or the coloring book that we covered a couple weeks ago. It's just like there's always one more thing where I'm just like, what is that? And this is definitely one of those things, which makes me think that it just wasn't something that made much sense. There's just not a lot of thought or care that went into the creation of the product. Larry Elmore did the cover paintings, and they're gorgeous. They're great Larry Elmore doing romance novel covers. And I think that that's fun and cool. I like the covers. I think, I'm never going to get rid of these stupid books because I like the way they look. Those are good. But like I said, Holloway's interior arts are just terrible. They're atrocious. I think he ranges from sort of like workhorse to really great. And you could tell there's just no energy. They're rough sketches. They're uninspired. And then the covers are like light cardstock, and they have a cutout oval, which is a feature, I feel like, of romance novels. You have that window pane, but like, they're terrible to hold. It's such flimsy material that you're just going to tear that thing right open.
Which could also be another reason why they're rare.
Yeah, for sure.
Because, if a person's actually going to read a book, every time you bend the cover, when you're dealing with that, wistful window pane cover, you're going to wreck it. So, yeah, finding one in good condition has got to be hard.
They're impossible to hold. And yeah, the only reason I found these in good condition is that I think that like somebody found them in like a back of a store. Like, these had never been opened. They were in perfect shape. And I feel like that's like the case. There's like some boxes of these in a Midwestern warehouse, long forgotten.
My knee jerk with this is like, I grew up with Nancy Drew, right? The plucky girl detective, always got the job done. I mean, granted, maybe not kicking the ass of the criminal, letting it for the police to solve, but nonetheless, like, there's been throughout history better female role models for books for young girls than just, I'm gonna go cry in my porridge and let Biff take care of it for me. I might learn to cast a spell or two, but I just use it to grow flowers or like whatever. My knee jerk with it was like, well, my God, I love the covers. I mean, granted, I hate the idea of the portrait window, but the covers look great. The covers are a very, like, it looks like a place in time where, like, I remember like things like Lisa Frank and like Mall Madness and like the very 80s style. Like, these are books and novels and toys made for girls, but the color palette is like outstanding and really cool looking. And I really was drawn to the covers when you first brought them over. And then also, like, I like the idea of like, oh cool, like this is adventurers, and there is romance to it. Because let's face it, I mean, this was like the 80s. Was there even like cryptozoological porn at that point? I mean, we were never going to see like Girl on Bugbear in one of these books. But stuff happens in the dungeon. Close quarters. You're fighting monsters together. You might fall in love. I loved Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Like, I love that kind of stuff as well. Like, I may not have really played the Dragon Age games, but I get why people were psyched on that. I love a good romance story. I'm here for it. However, I don't ever like the idea of you're a girl and you have to do this, and Mutt and Jeff are going to go take care of the heavy lifting. Like, come on. How could you ever want to expand your fan base to people other than like dudes who were, I guess in the 80s, the stereotypical D&D players when you're right in this direct?
Yeah, and a bunch of them are actually written by dudes too, even though they have lady pen names.
No, really?
Yeah.
Oh, that makes so much sense. Like which ones?
Book number 2, Talisman of Valdegard, is by Madeline Simon. I'm doing the air quotes. And that's actually Morris Simon writing under a female nom de plume.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a bummer. It bothers me. It makes it all feel more cynical and less serious. And like, I think that there's nothing wrong with this idea. I think that there's a market for this and people would be into it. And I always hated it when like they shoehorn in the love interest in a movie that doesn't need it. And it's obvious that it's shoehorned. And that's what these books are. They're extrapolated to that for a whole book. There's good romances out there and you could write good romances, but you have to like think about what makes a good romance and what you want to see and what readers want to see. And no thought has gone into this. And it's a bummer.
So it's not even just a good romance novel as far as like dime store romance. Like, okay, well, if it wasn't Dungeons and Dragons and if it wasn't for the fact that like this woman can cast spells or she's actually great with a sword or whatnot, it's just not a good love story.
No, they're terrible. There's one where your protagonist is a trained swordsman and like one of the love interests in the illustration spanks her with the sword. And it's just like, dude, she's the hero. You can't like, why are you trying to humiliate her? Like, that's one of the few illustrations in the book. Like, come on. It's just at a cross purpose to what anybody would want out of a book like this. Like, it's okay for girls to want to like kick butt and explore dungeons and seek adventure. Flipping through these books, I think I've been thinking a lot about the DuckTales cartoon. I watched the new version of the DuckTales cartoon, basically caught up on all of it earlier on in the pandemic. And Webby is my favorite character. She's amazing. She's hilarious and like plucky and adventurous and way smarter than the triplets. And she's a hoot. She's my favorite character. And I remember loving the old DuckTales cartoon. I fired a couple of those up. And man, the contrast, like Webby is so like these novels. Like she's a pink Cupid doll who talks like a baby, even though she's ostensibly the same age as Huey, Dewey, and Louie. And like all she cares about is cute animals. And like she's a scaredy cat, but always kind of getting into trouble dumbly. And like it's all these like negative girl things. And I say that because like she's a child. And as I'm watching this, I remember how much like Webby used to drive me nuts because she's such an obnoxious presence in the show. And the contrast between modern Webby, who likes all those things, she likes cute animals.
I mean, who doesn't?
She loves unicorns, but whenever she finds one, she gets like in awe and calls them sword horse.
That's awesome.
Yeah, because it's badass, you know, like it's a horse with a sword coming out of its head. That's what these books are, is Webby from the old DuckTales. It's just like the pink aisle of the toy store, like all of these preconceived notions about girliness and young girl things and how they are supposed to be treated and the way they're supposed to be interested in things. And you could tell that it's not done by people who have any experience with little girls, because I just don't buy that little girls aren't into the same stuff that little boys are.
Yeah, I mean, that's a fair point. I mean, I'll do you one better. I recently finished She-Ra and the Princesses of Power on Netflix.
Another excellent example.
Holy shit snacks, man. When I saw She-Ra when I was a kid, you know, I don't think she ever actually hit anything with her sword. I mean, she flat hit it with the flat of the sword, but never actually cut anything with her sword. I don't think she ever threw a punch. And it made no sense to me growing up because, you know, you have He-Man, the most powerful man in the universe, and this is his cousin who's equally as powerful, but not really. Whereas the new She-Ra, Noelle Stevenson, who was the showrunner on this, did such an exceptional job. Her and her team did such an exceptional job making a story where even the characters who were almost the comedic characters are still kicking ass. Like, everybody is taking care of business. They're fighting in a war. They're beating shit up. They're handling the day-to-day operations and not just like, oh, you know, my costume is silly, or I don't know what I'm going to do against all these robots. It's just like, no, you were going to wholesale annihilate these robots. You are She-Ra, Princess of Power. Like, they finally get the character right, I don't know, like 20-something years later, almost 30-something years later. And it's just kind of crazy where you look at storytelling, and you're very right with what you said about the old Toys R Us style. You know, this is the boy toy aisle, this is the girl toy aisle, and there should be no crossover in between. Where now it's like, yo, kids like what they like, and they're able to be kind of more open about what they like and see stuff that's like, oh my God, this is awesome.
And what I'm trying to get at, I think, overall, is that these books are from '83 and they reflect a certain era and mindset about what girls should be reading and thinking about. But just like Webby and DuckTales and She-Ra, I would love for this to get relaunched and modernized and made good, you know, because these are not good. We could completely disregard them as being like of any kind of merit. But the core concept of having choose your own adventures about adventure and romance is a cool one, and I would like to read those books. So somebody please make them.
Yes, and just make them without the portrait window on the covers, because, yo, that makes it really hard to read. Studio, any final thoughts on HeartQuest?
Yeah, I do, because when somebody does pick this up and redoes these and makes them awesome, and we get dungeon diving and romance choose your own adventure novels, I want to make sure that there's a woman writing them, because this whole dudes writing under lady nom de plumes is just nonsense.
Fair enough. Well, this has been another amazing episode of the Vintage RPG Podcast. Stu, where can the people find you?
They could find me on Instagram at Vintage RPG, where I post about stuff like HeartQuest books, unfortunately, but also other really great role-playing games and associated materials.
Very cool. You could find me on the Twitter at Handbreaker. I tweet about cute animals. See, I love cute animals. I tweet about Dungeons & Dragons.
Sword Horse.
And I tweet about things like professional wrestling. You can also find my day-to-day adventures in podcasting and life over on Instagram at John Hambone McGuire. If you like the show, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. Your reviews help other listeners to find us. And if you really like the show, like if you like the show, talking about like things like Mall Madness and things you would say back in the 80s. If you like the show, definitely think about stopping over to our Patreon, patreon.com/vintagerpg. We've got early release episodes. We've got some extra content. $5 tier gets you a sweet Vintage RPG tote bag. Lots of fun happening over on our Patreon, patreon.com/vintagerpg.
Hambone, there's going to be something exciting happening over on the Patreon soon, but I can't talk about it yet. But there's going to be something really exciting.
Oh yeah, I don't know if we were going to bring that up, but yeah.
Well, just a vague, tantalizing hint.
This is even worse than like when your cousin vague books something, and then you're kind of like, should I be concerned about that person, or is it just another like, look at me, I'm not going to tell you what I actually did. But there is something cool coming for our Patreon, so folks, stick around, stay tuned for that. And for Stu Horvath, I'm John Hambone McGuire. May the dice always roll in your favor.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to like, review, and subscribe to the podcast. Every review helps other listeners to find us. The Vintage RPG Podcast is a ham-fisted production. Music by Degger West. Art by Schaefer Brown. If you like the podcast, you should also consider becoming a patron at patreon.com.